In the silent corners of abandoned places, whispers of the past began to claw their way to the surface, foretales that defy understanding, each more haunting than the last. At a rundown apartment in the city, officers were called to confront a violent outburst, but what they found was something far darker. A man foaming at the mouth, screaming in languages no one recognized, and eyes that seemed to look straight into hell. In the vast loneliness of rural Wyoming, a scream echoed through the night, high-pitched, unnatural, slicing through the silence. Officers searched, but the source was nowhere to be found. The sound seemed to move, like it was following them. Then, on a quiet military base, a single footprint appeared in a locked, empty room. A child's, impossibly wet and facing the wall. They were alone, or so they thought. And in the north of England, two officers ventured into an abandoned farmhouse where strange symbols covered the walls. 4 stories, 4 encounters that defy all explanation, lurking just beyond the edge of reason. Some secrets want to stay hidden, but these echoes refuse to be silenced. Welcome to Retraced Echoes. Today we venture into the shadows of the unknown, a continuation of last week's story from the eyes of those whose duty is to protect and serve us. In this episode, we unravel tales of the supernatural as explained by military police and officers who've seen the unexplainable unfold before them. These are men and women trained to trust logic, to find reasons in chaos, but what happens when they come face to face with things that defy reason altogether? The stories you're about to hear are true accounts pulled directly from true ghost stories, real police ghost stories, true tales of the paranormal as told by cops and other law enforcement officials. Prepare yourself to cross the line between reality and the unknown.
In the heart of the city, where desperation lingers in every shadow, an officer answers a call. Routine at first until the air thickens with something unseen. A man stands in the darkness, eyes wild, muttering curses that cut deeper than words. What begins as an ordinary disturbance spiral into a nightmarish encounter with something that should not be. This is Eyes of the Devil.
It started as just a routine call, the kind that officers in this gritty part of the city handle daily. A domestic disturbance report in a neighborhood that was plagued by poverty, crime, and an undercurrent of fear that pulsed like a heartbeat through the streets. The officers, they barely blinked when dispatch mentioned it, but when they arrived, they found something altogether different. A small crowd had gathered on the grass outside of a dilapidated complex, kneeling, hands clasped in silent prayers, shadows lingering under streetlights, and the heavy silence hung in the air, punctuated only by the low murmur of whispered prayers. As the officers approached, they heard the faint chorus, mumbling voices of people that were terrified. "We're praying for our souls," one woman finally whispered when Officer Cain asked what they were doing. Her voice was trembling as she spoke. A chill ran down Cain's spine. He glanced at his partner, Officer Hughes, and they exchanged a wordless understanding. You see, whatever awaited them inside, it wasn't going to be ordinary. They entered the building, following the directions given by a shaken neighbor, leading them to an apartment where a possessed man was reportedly terrorizing his family. Cain almost rolled his eyes at the mere mention. "Probably just high out of his mind," he muttered. But even he could feel the tension in the air thickening with each step. Reaching for the door, they paused and just started listening. You see, there was low voices that was coming from within, but the eerie part was, this wasn't English or any other language that the officers could understand. It was just guttural sounds, strange syllables that was interwoven like twisted chant. A single voice, they had been told, yet it sounded like there was many people behind the door. They entered cautiously. The apartment, it was dim. The shadows were pulling in each one of the corners, the oppressive air making it significantly harder to breathe. The lead officer, unsettled by the eerie sounds in the atmosphere, he called for backup and EMTs. They would eventually find the family huddled in a corner, eyes wide, faces pale. One of the family members explained, with their voice shaking, that the man, he had been growing increasingly disturbed, speaking of invisible figures, becoming more gaunt, hollow-eyed with each passing day. Recently, he began ranting about breaking an agreement, screaming that he would be dragged into hell. As the officers listened, a new sound joined the night. It was the man's voice, rising in hysterical pitch. There were shouts and there was curses and prayers. They were all jumbled together, laced with an edge of pure, unfiltered rage. Then the sounds of something crashing. The family member that spoke with the officer earlier whispered that the man, he had been climbing the walls, his limbs contorting in unnatural ways and biting his own flesh until blood painted the cracked linoleum. With a backup team in place, Cain and Hughes approached the man's room. They found that the door was barricaded from inside, and after several tense moments, they finally forced it open, only to find the room in complete disarray. Blood had smeared the walls, twisted shapes drawn in what could only be the man's own blood, and in the corner, crouched like a feral animal, was the man, rocking and muttering, eyes glassy, his mouth foaming. As they tried to engage him, he looked up, his gaze meeting Cain's. The officer's breath caught. There was something wrong with those eyes, something inhuman, as if they held a void that threatened to swallow him whole. When he asked the man how he was feeling, the man gave a twisted smile and hissed, "God himself won't recognize you when I'm done with you." The officer, seasoned and hardened by years on the force, even they began to become scared. One clutching a rosary, his hand shaking. Another instinctively reaching for his weapon. You see, they knew they were dealing with something far beyond their comprehension. The man lunged, laughing, with a manic guttural sound. It took 6 of them to restrain him, each officer feeling the unnatural strength as he twisted and pulled, spitting words of venom, clawing at them with ragged nails. Eventually, a medic managed to sedate him, just enough to strap him down. But as they took him out, the man made eye contact with Cain once more. His eyes had gone to a strange milky white, yet they seemed to pierce into Cain's soul with a voice that seemed to echo in the stillness. He whispered, "Look closely, so you don't forget." Later, as they loaded him into the ambulance, Cain refused to ride along, choosing instead to follow in a patrol car, hands gripping the wheel super tight. When another officer, white-faced and shaking, asked him what he had seen, Cain could only mutter his eyes. They weren't human. It was like looking into the eyes of the devil. And long after that night, Cain would never forget those eyes, nor the feeling that somehow the darkness they had encountered wasn't done with him yet.
Out in the Wyoming wilderness, under a sky so vast it swallows the stars, 2 officers tread cautiously through the dark. A scream pierces the silence, high and unnatural, echoing through the trees. They search for its source, but each step leads them deeper into a mystery that defies the laws of the natural world. This is a scream in the night.
In the remote stretches of rural Wyoming, where the towns and neighbors are scattered by miles, the night settles deep and still. It's a kind of stillness that wraps itself around you, thick and oppressive, broken only by the distant howls of wolves or the rustling of unseen creatures in the bush. It was in such a night that Officer Walsh and his partner, Officer Turney, found themselves responding to an unusual call, a report of a suspicious-sounding echo from the direction of an isolated creek near a family's property. Now, the family was already outside when they arrived. They was all huddled together on the wooden porch, faces pale, eyes flickering in the direction of the tree line. The silence, it was broken by whispers, each one carrying an edge of fear. Walsh took a step forward asking about the noise, and one of the family members, they would point out into the distance. They would point towards the creek. It's like screaming, they said, voices trembling, but not quite human. The officers would stand with the family, and they just waited. See, for them to go and investigate, they had to hear the noise that the family was hearing. They wanted to rule out animals or whatever it may be. And the seconds, they would just tick by. Tick, 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 tick. Each one dragged on as the tension started to mount. Then, very faint at first, there was a sound that started to come from the woods, and then it would quickly start to rise. It was a scream. It echoed from somewhere deep within the woods, within the shadows. It was a shrill, like a woman's voice, but twisted. It was too high, too raged. It was carrying a distressing tone that neither officer could place. It rose, it held, and then it fell into silence again, leaving a natural void in its wake. The officers, they exchanged a look. Their training was telling them to try to rationalize whatever this was, to try to assign the noise to an animal. Maybe to even debate that this is possibly a prankster. But something about it defied logic. They instructed the family to go inside, to lock up, stay. They assured them that they would go and they would investigate and figure out whatever it was. They would start moving towards the creek, their flashlights barely cutting through the dark, illuminating branches that cast warped shadows along the ground. Each step felt like it was carrying them deeper into another world, a place untouched by the comfort of civilization. They heard the scream again, louder this time, reverberating off the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The sound twisted around them, slipping into their ears and settling uncomfortably in their chest. When they reached the creek, only the quiet rush of water met them. They stood still. They were straining their ears, hoping to catch any sign of movement, any hints of life. But there was nothing. Just the whisper of wind weaving through the tall trees and the unsettling quiet that seemed to press down on them. Minutes ticked by, stretching longer with each one, until finally, Walsh would say, "Must have just been an animal, maybe a fox." They turned to leave, but the scream returned, this time from behind them, back the way they had came. The officers froze, adrenaline spiking as they scanned the trees, their flashlight beam shaking slightly in their grip. Nothing but darkness and the echo of that scream, which was now fading, as if mocking their confusion. About halfway back to the house, the scream sounded again, louder and closer. It felt as though it was right beside them, a presence that eluded their eyes but clawed at their senses. Walsh would swing his flashlight around, heart pounding, searching the shadows, but there was nothing. No movement, no eyes gleaming from the darkness, just silence and the lingering echo of that blood-chilling sound. A shiver ran down both the officers, their hair on the back of their necks standing on edge as they quickened their pace. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. The rising dread spoke volumes. Whatever they were dealing with felt ancient, malignant, something that had no place in the world that they knew. Back at the house, they urged the family to call if the noise returned, but advised them to lock the doors and wait until the morning before venturing out. Walsh's voice, barely above a whisper, told them to stay safe and left with the other officer. As they would get back into the patrol car, The sound of that scream, it was still echoing in their head. It was deep within their minds, living rent-free. It was a sound that neither one of them could ever explain, a scream that felt less like a plea for help and more like a subtle warning. As they drove away, the silence of the night settled back over the land, thick and unbroken, as if whatever had been howling in the darkness decided it was done, at least for now. But deep down, Walsh knew that he'd never forget that sound, a scream that seemed to carry with it an age-old malevolence, one that lingered long after the night had swallowed it whole.
On a quiet military base where order and discipline rule, a lone footprint appears. A child's, impossibly wet, in a locked, empty room. No one should be there, yet something left its mark. In a place where logic should prevail, an unexplainable trace defies all reason. This is a footprint without a child.
For military police stationed on the base, night patrols, they were oftentimes routine, especially during the quiet winter months. They roamed the grounds, ensuring that doors were locked and alarms were secure, their only company, the steady hum of a distant generator and the occasional rustling of nocturnal animals. It was supposed to be another uneventful shift. Then the call came just after midnight. An alarm had tripped at the old elementary school on base, a small building meant for the children of military families. The MP and his partner drove over, checking the perimeter, and they found nothing amiss. Every door locked, every window secure. Reporting back, they chalked it up to just a malfunctioning alarm, and they moved on. But 20 minutes later, another call came through. The alarm had triggered again. The officers exchanged glances at each other, each feeling the prickle of unease starting to creep down their spine. Once more, they checked the building, their flashlights sweeping over empty halls and silent classrooms. This time they found a door slightly ajar, a maintenance room that led to the old boiler. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of oil and dust. Shadows stretched long, hiding cobwebs and rusting pipes. They searched every single inch, even checking the vents and the cupboards. They found nothing unusual. With a shrug, they secured the door, double-checked the locks, and resumed their patrol. The third call came an hour later. Same alarm, same school. At this point, they're frustrated. They've already been there twice. They've checked every door and every window. They've checked every nook and cranny. But it was their job, and they knew they had to go back. As they would check again, every door remained locked. Every room was empty, just as it had been before. They started to think that this had to be a prank, some type of a troublemaker that was yanking on the door just hard enough to trigger the alarm. Perhaps one of the older kids that was on the base that was just trying to get a little thrill late at night. They were determined to catch whoever this was, so they would ask for the assistance of the school's custodian, set up watch on the opposite side of the building. Silence would stretch on. Just hours. They just would slip by in the cold and the dark until finally the custodian radioed. The alarm had tripped again. But this time, it was from within the school itself. The three men would enter, each footsteps echoing through the empty halls. They combed through every single classroom. They would look in the maintenance closet, methodically opening every door, their flashlight carving paths through the shadowed corridors. The building was a maze of winding halls and dead-end rooms designed for an era long past. You see, it had seen generations of children pass through, growing from its worn desks and faded walls. When they neared the end of their search, they found a maintenance room with lights on. The door was slightly open. They paused, each one feeling the hair on their back of their neck rise. They were sure they hadn't been in this room yet, but no one had reported entering it either. The room itself was small, it was bare, few brooms, couple of boxes stacked in the corner, yet in the center of the room, something caught their eye. There in the dust, a single small wet footprint. It was unmistakable. The print of a small child's foot, almost as though it stepped straight from a puddle onto the floor, leaving a damp impression in its wake. But there was no water source nearby, no trace of any puddle, and no other footprints leading in or out. Just that one facing the wall, almost as though the child had materialized and then vanished into the solid concrete. A chill ran down every single man that was in that building, the hair on their arms standing straight up as they exchanged looks of quiet dread. They knew that they were alone in the building. They locked every door, checked every room, and swept every single inch. No children reported missing, and no one had entered or left during their search. The footprint remained silent and unexplainable, a lingering mystery, one that none of them could shake. Even now, on quiet nights, they sometimes find themselves haunted by the memory of that small, impossible mark, left by a child who should not have been there, and perhaps was never there at all.
In the forgotten ruins of an English farmhouse, whispers linger in the decaying walls. Strange markings cover the peeling wallpaper, and an eerie presence waits in the shadows, unseen but felt. When two officers venture inside, they find themselves entangled in a mystery that refuses to release its grip. This is Writings on the Wall.
The northern towns of England had seen better days. Once bustling with industry, the factories and mills that had sustained generations were now abandoned. Hollowed shells of a bygone era, rows of crumbling farmhouses and empty streets lined the countryside, a ghostly testament to an age that had long since faded. Those who remained in those desolate areas, they clung to a quiet existence, far from the bright lights of the city. For officers stationed here, the nights, they were oftentimes lonely. The hours stretched out under the sky so dark it seemed to swallow them whole. Officer James and Hartley, they knew these shifts all too well. They were partners and they were friends, bound by shared humor and an appreciation for the quirks of a forgotten town. Now, on quieter nights, they would oftentimes venture out to remote spots and stargaze and enjoy the stillness. It was on one of those nights that after hours without a single call, they decided to head out to an abandoned farmhouse. The structure stood just on the edge of a field, a silhouette against the stars, surrounded by patches of tall grass swaying in the breeze. It was the perfect place to wait out the night, or so they thought. As they approached the farmhouse, a flicker of a candle caught their attention from one of the old broken windows. They would exchange a glance. Teenagers, no doubt. They were lighting candles and playing pranks, as they sometimes did in this old forgotten place. The officers, they parked very quietly, hoping to catch the kids by surprise, but as they stepped closer, they realized something was way off. See, there was no laughter, no hurried whispers, just the faint crackle of a single candle flame and a silence that felt heavy. Peering through the shattered window, they saw a room cloaked in a shadow. The center sat a lone candle, surrounded by dusty books and brittle newspaper, forming a crude circle. Odd symbols were chalked onto the floor, looping and twisting into patterns that seemed to pull their eyes deeper. The room, it reeked of mildew and rot, the air thick with a scent of something long abandoned. Unable to shake the feeling that they was intruding, the officers climbed through the window, their footsteps echoing against the old wooden floors. They could see their own prints in the grime, a reminder that this place had been untouched for years. Yet, faint whispers, they lingered in the air, brushing past them like a memory half forgotten, just out of reach. James bent down, lifting an old newspaper from the 1930s, yellowed and brittle. Beneath it laid a journal filled with what looked like dark, frantic writing, lines upon lines of hatred and obsession. A man's confession of plans to harm someone he called Simon. The air seems to grow colder with each word they read, chill sweeping over them from the floorboards. A soft gasp came from the other officer. She stared at the wall, her eyes wide in disbelief. The wallpaper, once floral, was now covered in writing, strange symbols, repeated phrases, names all swirled together in a chaotic dance. At the center of it all, one phrase stood out, written in jagged letters across the wall. "Get out, or we'll find you, Simon. We'll kill us both." A sudden thud echoed through the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of a gasp, as though someone had become scared. Instincts flaring, the officers raised their flashlights, calling out, but only silence would greet them back. Then came the frantic steps of footsteps tearing through the next room, followed by the sound of the door, and then running through the field beyond. The police officers scrambled through the farmhouse, out the door, their flashlights slicing through the darkness, only catching glimpses of a shadowy figure running through the tall grass. They would chase it, their breaths. It was showing in the cold night air, but that figure, it moved with an unnatural speed, disappearing just as suddenly as it had appeared. They stopped, staring at the very spot where the figure had vanished, expecting to find disturbed grass or a fallen branch, anything to mark its passing, but there was nothing, just untouched earth, as if no one had been there at all. Undeterred, they called for backup, bringing in a canine unit. The dog picked up a scent, and it followed them through the field with renewed vigor. But as they neared the spot where the figure disappeared, the dog just froze, whispering, refusing to go any further. No amount of coaxing or commanding could move it. Whatever lay beyond was something even the animal refused to face. They would return to the farmhouse for just one final sweep, but when they re-entered the room, they become scared. The candle, the books, the newspapers, they were no longer there. There was thick dust all over the floor, and everything seemed to be untouched except for their own footprints, and yet the writing on the wall remained, the words seeming to whisper in the silence, the threat still echoing within the room. The officers left the farmhouse that night, locking its secrets behind them. They wrote in their report that the suspect had disappeared into the field with no further investigation needed. A week later, the farmhouse had burned to the ground, the flames consuming whatever darkness it held, and whatever secret had been waiting within its walls vanished into ashes. And there you have it, 4 tales that leave us questioning the very fabric of reality. Stories that show us just how thin the line is between what we know and what we fear. Tonight, we retrace the echoes of the past and of the things that hide in the shadows themselves. If these stories sent a chill down your spine or made you question what lies just beyond the edge of the light, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that doggone subscribe button. Also, leave us a review. Let us know that we're doing the things the way that you want them done. And also share your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you got a story of your own, something that still haunts you, head on over to retracedechos.com and submit your tale. Who knows? Your story might just be the next echo that we trace. Until I see you in the next episode, goodbye.